All right. Welcome back, people of the pod, to season 2, episode 2 of Office Hours with Karp and Loge. As always, I am Peter Loge, an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University and a strategic communications consultant. And I'm joined, as always, by
Dave Karp, also an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. It's Office Hours Summer School Edition, where you find out that your professors never stop talking like this.
That's why we have the job. They said, "Can you talk like this?" And they said, "Yes, in fact, we do all the time." So they just dropped us right in.
I used to joke that the reason I got a PhD is because I just thought I looked good in jackets with patches. Like you start with the style you want to have, and then you just work backwards.
That's actually why I've been a Democratic consultant and a college professor, because I just wear jeans, loafers, and button downs. And I'd rather be a dentist, but I don't have the wardrobe.
You have the vibe of a Democratic communications consultant.
I have the wardrobe for it. I've got the look.
You do have that vibe. It's true, and that's not a compliment.
I don't take it as one, but you got to go with what you got. All right. Thanks everybody who's been subscribing, who's been following us, who's been rating the podcast. We do, it turns out, have fans, which is pretty cool. And also always
I lose a bet, but
whatever. Look, people are tuning in, they're rating us, so keep tuning in and keep rating us. Also, thanks as always to our producer Alana Nevins, who puts up with all of this nonsense and cuts it into something reasonable and puts it on the pod platforms. We have a theme for the day. We have a theme, which is a new thing for us, and it's a obscure pop culture theme. In the words of Dale Bozzio, the lead singer of Missing Persons, in their 1982 MTV breakout hit, "Words, what are words for when no one listens anymore?" So these are maybe the importance, but certainly the limits of comms.
Should I mention how well I know that song and that reference?
I'm guessing you don't.
Yeah. It's Office Hours with Karp and Loge, where we make pop culture references that are too old for Dave Karp, who is quite old.
You're also not wearing a Mountain Goats t-shirt today, and I feel a little let down.
It's weird. Anyway, let's get to it.
How to feel about that. There's a link, by the way, to the video in the footnotes for all of you extras who missed MTV.
Link.
We're gonna drive up her sales. We're gonna do for Missing Persons what Stranger Things did for Kate Bush. We should now feel obligated to put a link into. All right, are we gonna start with guns? We're starting with guns.
Yeah, so I feel like there was a momentary upside after our last pod, where we actually had an announcement in the Senate of 10 Dems and 10 Republicans coming together and finding some compromise legislation that they could all support. Of course, since it's 2022 and we can't have nice things, that's now on the verge of falling apart. It's not clear whether it's going to happen or not. And there's also been a lot of debating within the Democratic Party ecosystem and the left ecosystem over whether this compromise bill is such a compromise that it just provides cover for the Republicans. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I'm not optimistic about the legislation passing. I think it falls apart. Just the time is short. Congress is about to go out on recess. They've got a lot of other stuff they have to do. They're distracted. Republicans are taking a lot of heat. As we noted 2 weeks ago, an incumbent Republican member of the House from New York State was basically chased out of Congress. He's not running for re-election because he supported gun control. Senator Cornyn was booed at the Texas Republican Convention for supporting this deal. I'm not optimistic, but I do think that the whatever deal they come up with, even if it's a statement that says, "Please stop shooting people unless you really absolutely have to," anything, take the deal, because then you can create a bit of political safety. Say, look, there's all the shouting in the far right ecosphere on Twitter or whatever about how awful any gun deal is. You voted for this and you didn't lose, or you somehow tell the story that why this debate was good, why this gun vote was good, and then you sort of begin to build a bit of positive momentum, right? As you and I have both talked about in the past, it's not just the legislation that passes, it's the story about that legislation, right? Because it's a story of elections that determines future elections. Again, listeners already know this from listening a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the gun debates in the 90s. in the 2000 election when the NRA declared that guns cost core the White House, and the Democrats happily agreed and therefore stopped talking about guns. So I agree with you completely.
Yeah, the thing that would drive home here, I don't know whether the legislation is actually going to come up for a vote. But if it does, this is a spot where you take the compromise. And the reason for that, the way that guns as a political issue is different than, say, climate, where I think I would have a very different stance, is you will get another bite of this apple soon. If you pass the easiest stuff in the world right now, since there's going to be another mass shooting because our gun policies are ridiculous and we are so far away from where we need to be, that there will be another window of opportunity where you say, okay, we did all of the easiest stuff. The shootings are still happening. Now we need to talk about an assault weapons ban, or now we need to talk about the next thing. So you take the easiest wins now here because you know that there will sadly be another window of opportunity. If it's climate or it's another issue where realistically you're going to get one shot in the next decade, that's a spot where you need to be bolder and get more things at once, because you know there's not going to be another opportunity anytime soon. But on guns, yeah, take this win and start being able to tell the story that we are allowed to do sensible regulations on guns. The sky does not fall down.
And I mean, to your point that there's going to be another shooting, there've been other shootings, right? Yeah. In the previous footnotes of the podcast, both on Medium, on my page of Medium, on peterloge.com podcasts, put up a link to a mass shooting database. And I'm just looking at it now, June 20th, New York, 1 person killed, 8 injured. Here in Washington, D.C., 14th and U, a couple of blocks from where you used to live and where I currently live. I was down the street having dinner with friends. There was a lot of gunfire. When a 15-year-old was killed, 3 others were injured. On the 19th in Detroit, on the 19th in Waterboro, South Carolina, Miami, Florida, Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's all on the 19th. Yeah. So yeah, it's happening more. Like, take the deal you can get, demonstrate it's just not a big deal. Of course you can pass little things, it's not a big deal. Of course you can pass little things, it's not a big deal. It's sand piles, right? I absolutely agree. I want to run some other ideas by you though about the gun, about comms and guns. So one thing we talked about a few weeks ago is framing. And I think we agreed that if you lead with guns, that's bad, right? I believe in the Second Amendment, but I support guns, but. In the early days, like 2 weeks ago of the debate on guns, Cheryl Thompson, our colleague, who was hosting All Things Considered Weekend, and she was there's a story about the March for Life and the gun rally here in DC, and quoted activists as saying, "I don't object to guns, and we have the right to safety." So I think that's not great messaging because you're leading with guns. Can we agree on that?
I agree that you don't want to start with the Second Amendment frame. What you want to do is introduce the alternate frame, which to me, again, is I would call them deadly weapons instead of guns.
Yep.
And I would say my line is always, we should be regulating deadly weapons as much as we regulate Sudafed.
Yeah.
Right. Like, there's a mistake that gun advocates routinely make of trying to compare guns to cars and say, well, all these people die in car crashes, we don't regulate cars. And the answer is, yeah, we do. Like, what advocates want is to regulate guns as much as we regulate vehicles and Sudafed and everything else.
So there was
special.
There was a piece quoting somebody, the Washington Post quoted somebody at a Milwaukee rally for March for Our Lives, Milwaukee rally, holding signs saying things, when they love their kids more than they love guns, referring to the NRA. And hey, NRA, how many kids have you killed today? Thoughts?
I mean, they're activist slogans. Like, hey, NRA, how many kids have you killed today, is a thing that you yell out of rage and despair. And I get the rage and despair. It doesn't really matter to me because that's just if that's just the thing you're shouting, that's fine. But in terms of the core message that we need to get out there, again, we need to move away from Second Amendment pro or con to what are these sensible regulations for deadly weapons. That's not going to fit into like the rally chants, but that's the point that you want to be making when you're actually talking to the media.
All right, so we've got it's the what now, what next, what then. So what now is expressing the rage. What next is passing some legislation, doing some reframing. So I'm going to ask you another question about framing here. two different ways to go about this. One is defining this as a public health issue.
Mhm.
So we have an epidemic of gun violence. We have an epidemic of suicide. Young people are committing suicide. How do we constrain suicide? So now you're foregrounding public health and suicide, which is unfortunately, tragically, a lot of gun violence. And then, oh, the solution then becomes guns, as opposed to the problem is guns that we have to solve on themselves.
Mhm.
Is that a meaningful shift? Is that a helpful shift?
I I would have been more optimistic about that shift before the pandemic, but I think public health itself has now become polarized in a way that means that doesn't end up doing much work.
Is public health polarized in general or only around the pandemic?
I think in general.
Well, that's
I
bad
think
news.
particularly now, I think we now have a Republican Party network that has decided that the idea of public health is how the government tries to control your lives. And so it's actually not useful for guns or for public health to say like, oh, and it's also the way that the government's going to take your guns away. Like the move from that side now, and I mean, hell, we're seeing this in the courts as well, is to undermine the ability of the administrative state to do anything for public health or for anything else, right? Like government is not allowed to mandate basic public health measures, and that's outside of guns. If you add guns on top of that, I think that ends up being unhelpful for both.
So well, I want to get to the administrative state
Yeah.
later in the podcast, because I know you have a lot to say about that, which is terrifically important. But I want to stick on this public health messaging for a bit, right? Because for a while, the Centers for Disease Control has been talking about guns as public health. There's a battle over whether or not Congress could fund the Centers for Disease Control to study gun violence as a public health measure.
Mhm.
There's research oft-cited, as you know, about framing violence as either sort of a predator, a beast at the door, or on the other hand, an epidemic or an outbreak. And in this famous study that I'll throw into the footnotes and the links, when respondents were presented the data and a beast at the door, predators on the streets frame, the answer was lock them up tough on crime. Presented data and there's an epidemic, there's an outbreak, sort of epidemiological metaphors. The response was, we've got to get to the root cause and prevent. Everybody is asked, why did you come to the conclusion? And the answer was, well, obviously it's in the data. The data didn't change.
Mhm.
All that changed was the framing of the metaphor, right? So people have hung on to this public health metaphor for a while as a way to get stuff done.
Mhm.
Are you suggesting that now it's actually lost its force or might actually be counterproductive?
So my instinct is, all of that data is lacking strategic operators trying to weaponize the counterframe. And I think what we started to see mid to late pandemic, and I say that as though pandemic's over, and it's not. But after the first 6 months or so of the pandemic, we started to see public health and the Centers for Disease Control becoming the villains, right? Like early pandemic, Anthony Fauci was trusted by everybody. Now he's the villain for one of the two parties in this country. So now that public health is getting stood up as, those are the deep state goons who are trying to control your lives. Now that that's going on, I would expect if people are presented with the epidemic framing, that's going to come along with a hefty dose of people saying, not only were they trying to like shut you indoors, but now they're also trying to take your guns away. We got to rail against all of this. I would expect that makes the entire thing perform way worse.
That's interesting and terrifying. And maybe a future podcast is how do we take back the narrative about or build trust again in public health institutions. As you know, I was at the FDA at the end of the Obama administration, and we've been in the press a fair amount talking about this. I'd love your insights and answers. So another idea then on guns.
Mm-hmm.
This will also go in the links in the podcast, the footnotes links. And that is, what about arguments that Hollywood should be modeling better gun behavior, right? So in TV shows, NCIS or cop shows or whatever, people who have guns say, oh, don't forget to lock up the guns, store the ammunition separately from the weapon, all of this, because most gun violence, again, isn't mass shootings. Most of it's suicides or accidents. So you're not telling anybody anything. You're not railing on it. You're just modeling good behavior. And I think a bit of an example of this is the anti-drunk driving designated driver campaigns coordinated by the Harvard School of Public Health and activists, I guess in the 70s or 80s.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of this idea of Hollywood modeling good gun behavior?
I think it's nice. I don't think it's gonna do a lot of work. And again, that's because the issue's polarized. When you get mass media modeling drunk driving behavior and having a real impact, that's in a spot where you don't have one of the two parties actively constructing identity in opposition to it. So I would expect that if Hollywood does a really good job of that, I think that can, in like low level, inform people that this is gun safe behavior and you should be doing it if you're somebody who owns guns. I think you're also going to have the Tucker Carlsons of the world and the like internet radio shock jocks taking individual episodes of that and saying how they're trying to like sissify guns by like having a gun safe. And they're going to get a bunch of views for that because they're obnoxious as hell and it's going to feel like red meat to them. And that's then going to weaken the impact because again, everything is going to go through these polarized meta identities. So like if Hollywood is deciding whether or not to do that, like, yeah, do it. I don't think it'll hurt, but I wouldn't expect to get big leverage from that just because the polarization of identity ends up just being such a big factor here.
All right, so the best hope we have now on guns is maybe possibly the Senate passing incremental reform, which is seriously weakened and watered down, but we should take the deal because it's the best we're going to get. So we're going to take that as the good news of the day.
That would be a big win if it happens. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I would call that a big win. We would celebrate on this podcast.
There you go. Yeah. Let's move on to then something else, which is also depressing where comms might not also help. January 6th. Commission. The next, we're recording this on a Tuesday morning. It'll probably drop right around as the next hearing is being nationally televised. I understand the viewer will be very interested in that. What's your take on the hearings in general?
I feel like we set the stage for this in the last podcast. I think they have done as well as one can do from a comms perspective with the hearings. The first hearing actually got something close to like 20 million viewers. That's a lot of viewers. And in the long term, I think there's this baseline sense amongst everybody who's tuning in and the media who's covering it, that this probably doesn't matter in the way that it should matter, that this isn't going to affect votes. This isn't going to lead partisan elites to behave. And like the one thing that's almost definitely going to happen out of this, I would think, this is guaranteeing that Liz Cheney's going to lose her primary. So the one Republican who is in Congress and was planning to stay in Congress, who was willing to stand up for, hey, people shouldn't sack Congress and try to kill us, is going to get kicked out by her party from this. That's bad. So on the one hand, I think that they are doing as well as they can do. And they're also running up against the limits of when one of the two parties has decided that they are in favor of this and will counter program hard against it, that they just are going to do everything they can to make this not matter. No matter how good your comms are, that is just a ground reality that you can't work around. American democracy only works if we have two parties that both are committed to democracy. Right now, one of our parties is not. Only Republicans can fix the Republican Party. This isn't going to be the thing that fixes the Republican Party.
I fully agree. First of all, on the viewers and the ratings, the first episode of the hearings, really well produced. Really, it was really compelling. I think the tone was completely appropriate. It was straightforward. There were no histrionics. It was just a, here's what happened. Somber tone, well paced, well directed. As you say, roughly 20 million viewers, which is more than the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. Somewhat less than Trump's renomination speech, which he probably illegally gave from the White House. It was shown on every major news network. Networks that did not show the first hearing in prime time included the Cartoon Network, Animal Planet, and Fox.
Right. And Fox decided not to have advertisements because they didn't want their viewers to switch away and see the hearings.
Right. And they had it on like Fox Business or something that drew 225,000 viewers. And online, Fox, it turns out, has an online channel aimed at an African-American audience. And I only know this because a friend of mine, turns out, hosted that program and broadcast. She's felt like this is crazy and this is dumb, but somebody has to do this and this is important, so I'm going to do it. The daytime hearings, unsurprisingly, have fewer viewers. Fox did carry those. when they're 10 in the morning, they're 2 in the afternoon. People have jobs, and it's also just less compelling, like you've seen the first one, you feel like. But I agree with you that this is important to have done, right? Normally, we talked about this 2 weeks ago. Normally, as a political guy, I like to pick a fight either that I can win or that I'm going to lose that will get me something in the long run. This matters because this matters, right? I'm deeply invested in this notion of an American democracy, as imperfect as it is, but getting better. And unless you call this stuff out, unless you hold it up, then it doesn't really matter. So this is just important to do because it is an important thing to have done. And it is also, it is a bit of a distraction, right? I mean, there's a bit of an agenda setting effect, which means other people can't fully control the agenda. It's a little bit of, and if enough Republicans who push back against the big lie, as in Georgia, for example, win primaries, then, maybe this becomes there's less of a political incentive to embrace the obviously crazy and venal. And more Republicans will say, you know what, I can actually be pro-democracy, but also pro all these conservative things and also get elected. Let's go back to doing that again, which is how people like Representative Cheney wound up in Congress in the first place.
Yeah, the thing I would also add is, if we work backwards from a future where the Republican Party has fixed itself, right? So that's an optimistic future in which both of our parties return to taking government and governance seriously and being committed to basics of electoral democracy. I imagine that any future where that happens is one where the people who win those fights found this to be useful, right? Like the TV moments of Judge Ludig, who's a hardcore conservative, warning that we're about to lose American democracy, that the threat is not gone. Those moments are resonating amongst some people who currently are Republicans and don't have a lot of power in the party network. In a future where they regain control, this ends up being useful to them. And we look back at it and say, wow, that was really well done. The worry is, I don't know how we get to that future, and I'm not sure how likely that future is. And if we end up in a future where American democracy fails, then we look at this and say, God, was there anything else that they could have done? This was such a moment. Should they not have done it at all? I think, of course, they should have done it, because if we end up in a future where the Republican Party gets committed again, this ends up being useful. But also, again, comms can't fix that alone. You need partisan elites on both sides who actually decide that democracy is worth defending.
And again, it's telling the story of what happened, right? Because so much of elections are out of comms control. It comes down to gerrymandering or the feeling of the economy or, a million other things. But if you can coherently and compellingly tell a story that doubling down on Trump's lie didn't help you, but it did undermine democracy, or in fact, it hurt you around the margins because it depressed turnout or it turned off suburban white women or whatever, tell a compelling story. And if elections come down to 1, 2, 3%, that's fine. Helping around the margins is fine.
Yeah.
Right. So good to have done. With an eye to the clock, I want to ask a couple more questions about January 6th and comms. Bloomberg wrote a piece on Democrats and Republicans fundraising off of January 6th, which is unsurprising. The Republicans raising a lot more money than Democrats. Mike Nellis, who's a digital consultant, he does email campaigns, runs a company called Authentic out of Chicago, had a longer explanation both in the Bloomberg piece, but also on LinkedIn, and the link will be in the footnotes, pointing out that for Republicans, this is, oh, they're out to get us, oh, the deep state, which we're going to get to in a second with your rant. But what really matters for most people most of the time, and certainly for Democrats, is inflation. Right. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting, this is happening. Of course, Republicans are raising money off of it. Of course, Republicans are saying, oh, Nancy Pelosi wants to do whatever. Democrats are saying, look at those Republicans are undermining democracy. The threat to democracy is great. It is effective. The comms is effective at energizing a Republican base or a section of the Republican base and raising a section of Republican money. But it's not working among Democrats because either we already know it or Dems are more motivated by what matters to most of us, which is like inflation and crime and schools and all of that. Or if you're a Democrat activist, probably Roe is going to be much more of a motivator.
Well, there's that. And I think the added thing is there's a clear endpoint to the Republican story, which is the deep state is attacking us, which means they're attacking you. Donate so we can fight back, and we're going to win this and undo the last election. I mean, we haven't mentioned this yet, but the Texas Republican Party just passed a platform that said that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president, along with a bunch of other batshit stuff. That is extremely dangerous. But it also tells a clear story with an endpoint of like, the rightful ruler of this country has been deposed. We're going to get him back. And the story that's being told to Dems is, hey, do you remember a year and a half ago when they tried to overthrow democracy? That's still a threat. Please give us money so we can keep on trying to stop that threat. I don't think it's that Democrats look at that and say, yeah, but what I care about is inflation. It's that Democrats look at that and say, I mean, okay, I can give you some money on that, but like, it doesn't seem like it's going to stop the threat.
I also think that it's just less salient. I mean, it's the wolf at the door versus the termites in the basement. I know the termites in the basement are chewing the house. I don't quite know what to do about it. That's a long-term thing, because the wolf at the door shoot the wolf.
Yeah.
Right. And attempts to undermine democracy have been termites in the basement of our American polity for decades. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, the wolf at the door is Roe, it's inflation, it's, climate, you sort of run down the list.
But I want to move to point out is all of those things have the same category of sort of a baseline despondency of like, what are you really like? You can talk about Roe, but the question for Democrats with Roe is like, okay, if I give you money to run Senate races, how is that going to repair Roe? Like, all right, let's win a bunch of Senate seats and then maybe we can pass it as federal law. But like, this is going to get into the thing I want to yell about. Conservatives have a 6-3 Supreme Court majority. Unless Democrats are really planning to expand the court, everything else, you can tell me about how like we're existentially threatened, and we are, but your answer to it is just like, yeah, we're going to treat everything as normal because we want our institutions to stand up and like maybe they'll behave better. Let's try to at least get through the next election. There's not a clear story of I've written in the past about sort of the difference between the politics of opposition and the politics of articulation. It is easier to be in opposition and say the bad guys are in power, help us win so we can get them out. Like if Roe was getting overturned when Donald Trump was president, then it would be a very simple story to say the bad people are running things, help us, like help fund us so we can knock them out and we can stop the bad things. Roe passing when Democrats run the House, the Senate, and the presidency leaves grassroots Democrats saying like, okay, we're going to keep you in power. That's not changing the status quo. So if the status quo is terrible, it seems like what I should be doing is either rioting the streets, or deeply protesting the streets, or sitting alone with a glass of whiskey. Like, what are we doing here? Right. And that's just a fundamental thing of it's all termites because there's not a single thing which, if we do it, it's going to make everything better.
Right. I mean, Trump was the wolf.
Yeah. Like inflation. Okay. Like what magic wand are we going to give to who to stop inflation? Right. Larry Summers was talking yesterday about how the way we ought to stop inflation is to have 5% or higher unemployment. Like, cool, let's have a bad recession for a while so that we can get rid of inflation. Like, I'm not an economist, but like, can we maybe try the supply side instead of the demand side? But again, if there's no real solution here, so what are we even doing?
Even if that is a way to work, it's not a great bumper sticker.
Not a great bumper sticker, bad politics, and also like my God, man, like that's not something you're getting anyone excited about.
All right, more to be discussed on that, but the clock is running, and you are concerned that the administrative state is going away, and that's going to be the end of everything.
Which is so on brand for me. Coral Davenport in the New York Times, we'll put this in the show notes, had a great long piece over the weekend about a court case that's about to be decided in the Supreme Court, which is both most likely going to undermine the ability of the EPA to regulate anything, particularly carbon in the atmosphere, climate change, but is also probably going to end what's called the Chevron deference, which is law that dates back to, it dates back to the early 1980s. But that is the rule amongst the courts that they're going to give deference to the executive branch in interpreting laws passed by Congress. Essentially, the way Stevens explained it when he wrote that ruling back in the 80s was, since judges aren't the main experts here, like we ought to give deference to the people who have actual policy expertise. And that has been necessary both for climate, but also for things like regulation, like SEC regulations. Conservative lawyers have for a while now decided that they hate that because that allows for us to have an administrative state instead of a weird Ayn Randian nightmare. And it looks like when this case gets decided, they are probably going to chop that up. So A, that means that we no longer will functionally have any levers to do anything about climate, but it also means that if you want to go after white collar crime, can't do it. If you want to do anything on public health, can't do it. Like they will have, with a 6-3 administrative majority, made the country functionally ungovernable. And that's just going to happen. Again, that's not a thing that we can vote out. So the thing that I keep being left with on this, there's a book that I've teased you with the title of it before. I teach in class called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is not actually an instruction manual on how to blow up pipelines, but is an ethical case for climate activists starting to destroy property out of a recognition that all of the normal policy levers don't work anymore. I find that to be a really interesting piece to think with. I think it forces people to, including me, to ask tough questions. But I was thinking about that a lot in reading Coral Davenport's piece, because if the Supreme Court does what it looks like they're about to do and makes it so that at least until there's a change on the Supreme Court, which is multi-decades, and we don't have that time, it makes it so that climate activists can no longer look at the administrative state for solutions. It means that we can't regulate tailpipe emissions. We can't consider climate effects when deciding what to build. That essentially the government cannot address climate. And if that's the decision that the court is about to make, then strategically, again, like there's not gonna be a calm solution for activists out there. The only solution, if the government isn't an answer, is gonna be property destruction. Like if they decide to make this country ungovernable, then the only strategic solution for activists is gonna be to act as though the country's ungovernable. That's gonna be a giant mess. I'm not looking forward to it. But I wanna point out now that that is clearly where we're heading, because you take away all of the legitimate policy levers, all you're left with is illegitimate policy levers. That's all we're gonna have left.
I mean, this is like you run up to the limit of comms pretty quickly. Comms can nudge, or they can reframe, they can move things in different directions. But ultimately, if people feel as if they don't have power, or if people feel as if they're out of their control, things are out of their control, they lash out, right? And I think that's probably part of the reason for the rise of the far right in the US. People feel like they're being ignored, or nobody's paying attention to them. And then you've got right-wing media feeding that. Everybody hates you, therefore lash out. The only legitimate thing to do is lash out. Right, there's a fair amount of research that people like elections because they can throw the bombs out and they can just, change everybody. They want to hire people. They vote for people so they can hire them to fix things. Things aren't being fixed. I'm going to vote somebody out. I'm not voting somebody in. I'm voting somebody out. Right, it's a way to take this action. And if you remove that, then you lose that. Many more conversations about political incentives for Congress to punt to the executive, the growing power of the executive. Many more things to talk about. Not today, because we're just about at time. A couple of last minute plugs and things to look for, some of which we'll just put off for future weeks. But I do want to say kudos, great stuff in Thomas Edsel's column in the New York Times.
Thanks.
Which I have tweeted out, and I will put in a link. And also, you said interesting things on somebody else's podcast. So
yeah,
I feel like
I like talking about politics and I like talking about tech. I got to go on somebody else's podcast, Justin Hendricks's podcast, and talk about tech. That was fun.
So well done. What are you looking for in the next 2 weeks? What's the look ahead?
A nap. No, I think the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be watching the hearings and seeing if there's any surprising point of hope. I'm going to be looking to see whether or not we get something through on guns, because right now I think both of us are pretty skeptical, but it's at least more likely than we thought it was 2 weeks ago. So I'll watch for that. And I'm personally just going to try to get some writing done in the next couple of weeks, because that's what professors do in the summer.
What are you working on? What are you writing?
A bunch of essays. I'm going to be trying to finish up a piece looking back at the rise and fall of the political blogosphere, what we can learn from it.
Very cool. Very cool. That sounds like a very good 2 weeks. I'm looking for the vote on guns. I share your skepticism, but maybe smart people will come up with creative answers that can bypass Congress. I too will be watching the hearings. I'm looking for a big finish, and I think they're gonna end strong. This is being produced, as a couple of people have noted in print and online. It's basically a true crime podcast, right? And so you want to end strong, you want to finish strong. I am also going to be in San Sebastian or Donostia, depending on your politics, when the next pod drops. So I'll be looking for talking about constructive national identity, which I can bore people with, but also really good food and a really pretty place. All right. Where can people find your writing and find your ranting online?
I tweet a lot at Dave Karp, DaveKarpf, and I write on Substack, davekarp.substack.com.
And I'm on Twitter at PLOGE, Ploge on Twitter, and peterloge.com/podcast, and also on Medium. Thank you always to our pod listeners. Thank you to our producer, Alana. If you like what you heard, tell your friends, give us a rating, follow us. If you don't like it, do it anyway. Come on, what do you got to lose? All right. All right, I feel like we should go out to the music of Missing Persons and Words, but we've got a small budget.
Everyone who was born in 1978 or younger can find out what the hell you're talking about.
We can't afford the music rights though, so people are gonna have to click on the link. Good night, everybody.
Bye, folks.